Good afternoon.
CxAlloy is leading the way in revolutionizing the commissioning industry.
I came with a mission and a vision for CxAlloy. And that mission is to aid commissioning firms in capturing and amplifying the full value of their efforts.
When we talk about commissioning and CxAlloy and softwares like this is not adding extra work, but just making it easier for everyone. That's where CxAlloy really leverages a lot of the things within the commissioning process and makes it easier for people to use.
CxAlloy is super useful for having all the information at hand and being able to give that information easily and aesthetically.
CxAlloy is not about adding extra work, but alleviating it.
Good afternoon. My name is Karen Shunk with the Energy Management Association. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar and thank CxAlloy for sponsoring today's session. A few items before we get started. We will be holding questions till the end of the presentation, but we encourage you to submit them at any time using the Q&A button. If you happen to be experiencing technical problems during the webinar, please use the Q&A button to inform the panelists, and our producer, William, will assist you. This presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing in about a week. For continuing education credit, everyone in attendance for the full webinar will receive a certificate of attendance sent to their email within about 24 hours. And if you are a certified CXA or EMP, your CEUs will be uploaded to your respective portals a few days after the webinar. Today's webinar is Commissioning and Energy Management in Buildings and Facilities with Jacob Terry, Director of Product Development for CxAlloy. Jacob is based out of Atlanta and has been working with the CxAlloy software since 2006. He's a self-taught programmer with a BA in print journalism and an MBA from the Georgia Institute of Technology. He is CxAlloy's Director of Product Development and is focused on deploying software features that empower customers. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and I'll hand it over to Jacob now to kick us off.
Wonderful. Thank you. Hello to everyone. I appreciate you being willing to join today, and hopefully I'm able to provide something that you'll find valuable. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, jump into my presentation. Plan here is to shoot for about 45 minutes for what I have to share, and then the remainder of the time Q&A. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. The focus of my presentation today is about progress tracking for commissioning projects in particular. I think there's some principles here that I'll be talking about that are actually applicable to almost anything that you might be concerned about tracking progress on. You'll see as we go into this that some of the concepts are quite general in terms of things to be thinking about when you're setting up a progress tracker. So some learning objectives here that you can look at, right? But basically we're going to talk about different approaches that can be taken, pros and cons of those, and I have some recommendations and best practices in my opinion, based on not my own direct experience doing this, but in talking to a lot of different commissioning providers and how they do this work, how they track the progression of their efforts on a project, and by actually looking at, as you'll see in a moment, the files and sort of trackers that they put together directly themselves. So to put this together, the background here is that I have 40 plus different commissioning progress trackers that I have gathered over the past about 2 years now. And the purposes of me doing that was because we're working on internally at CxAlloy, and we currently have like an early access release of it, a new feature, a new whole area of our product that was about progress tracking, right? Call it milestones. And as we move forward to build that out, the very first thing to do is, okay, what's the need, right? And great way to look at need is, what are people organically doing on their own? What are they building on their own to track the progress of their commissioning projects? So you see here a smattering, and I've got some more you can see coming up here, right? So all these different example files. These are all real world examples, actual trackers put together by different commissioning firms. I've redacted them all so that, none are directly, there's no company names or anything on any of these, but they're all actual real world trackers that I think we can learn a lot from. So before I get into it, one of the questions that come up when I've talked about this before is, okay, these are nice tips for how you can track progress, but why do that at all? And maybe for some folks that seems like a silly question. I mean, of course we need to, but others say, why, right? Maybe I haven't ever really explicitly tracked progress in any sort of, dedicated Excel file or similar sort of thing. Why do I need to do that, right? And I think there's a variety of reasons for this. I want to go over a number of these, right? So validate that the actions you're taking are achieving the goal. And sort of tied to that, evaluate performance and validate assumptions. And this gets to something that I think I've experienced this in a different domain, software development, a number of times, which is that sometimes things aren't working the way they should, right? So like, as an example, in software development, web application development, you might have a web page, one, of the application that is taking a really long time to load. Rest of the application loads in a second or two. This page takes 15 seconds, something like that. And what I've seen happen, not just seen happen, what I myself have directly done in the past sometimes is gone and looked at kind of what's going on there and said, I know what's going on. It's obvious to me that this loop of, we're looping 10,000 times here in the code. That's got to be the problem. Of course, that's going to take 15 seconds. I'll change the whole thing and fix that. And I go in and I make the edits and I change that and I load the page up and it still takes 15 seconds. I go, what in the world? Well, I had assumed I knew what the problem was without validating, without actually directly checking it. And then I had gone and solved the wrong problem, right? And that wasn't actually the problem. I've personally done this multiple times. You could have similar scenarios yourself in any domain. You can have that, right? Where you go, oh, okay, it's taking us a long time to get this testing complete. It must be because the contractors aren't ready for us, or something like that, whatever, and you go, that's really what the problem is. And without actually have done the work to sort of validate that that's the case or not. And progress tracking is one way to create some, as you'll see later, we get into create some baselines and do some like live, progress verification to better determine where the bottlenecks are coming and where the actual problem lies. So then the actions that you take can actually solve the real problem, right? Versus an assumed problem. And like I was saying, I definitely know that it's easy to assume the wrong thing is the problem. Related to that, I identify deviations early, right? So if you're doing this consistent progress tracking as you go, it's easier to see when you start getting off track, right? If you're waiting until certain invoicing milestones or things like that, and you go, oh, wait a second, we've done all these hours, but we're not as far along in the project as I would have expected, or things like that, right? It's hard to kind of work backwards sometimes to identify where things started to go wrong. If you're doing a consistent tracking over time, it's easier to identify those as they start to develop, and therefore hopefully easier to identify what the origin of them is, where the cause is. Effectively allocate resources. I'm sure in commissioning, one issue that comes up all the time is sending people out, and it can be very expensive, right? Flights, miles, time away from other responsibilities that you send someone out to go on site and do some testing or things like that. And it turns out you're not able to do it yet, right? It's a very inefficient, ineffective resource allocation when that happens. And of course, it's probably never purposeful, and yet it happens. Are there ways that we can do better at that? Well, one way, there's many different things you would need to do, but one way is to be more consistently tracking where things stand on your project before you go ahead and take those actions, those more expensive actions, right? Sending someone out and so forth. And then preparing for common stakeholder questions. And I have this phrase this way very specifically, right? Where it's not just about it's not just about questions that you know that they've already told you they have or are built in. It's about questions that they may have in the future but haven't asked you yet that you should consider being prepared for. And that can take a lot more time and effort than you expect. I had an interesting experience when I was doing an MBA. One of the classes I took was this entrepreneur class, very good class, enjoyed it greatly. And it was an interesting one because at the beginning, the professor says, okay, like the only real graded assignment in the class was a pitch. I think it was a 2.5 minute pitch, something like that. At the end of the semester, we're going to be pitching a business idea or a product or something like that. And you think, oh my goodness, this class is a cakewalk, right? Like 2.5 minute pitch, I could come up with that the 15 minutes before class starts, right? No big deal. What a cakewalk, right? But what the reality was, and he did a good job of kind of educating this throughout the course of the semester of that class, was yes, it's going to be a 2.5 minute pitch, but then it's going to be open for questions. And whatever questions I want to ask, I want you to have good answers for, right? And that actually opens up, it's like your pitch is the tip of the iceberg, and then everything else that you need to know is all that underneath the water iceberg, right? It can be the same thing on any project, and be the same thing in commissioning projects. It's like, okay, great, you're halfway done with a pre-functional checklist. Okay, well, which pre-functional checklists in what disciplines? How far are you done with mechanical versus electrical? Which of your subs are the ones that are holding us back? What specific, how come we're not as far as we should be in this area? What about system XYZ? What about system, what about the building one? All these different breakdowns and subdivisions of the data or insights that they may ask that you want to be prepared to answer confidently, competently, correctly, right? And so by tracking progress at on an ongoing basis at the right level of detail, as we'll get into, right, you can be prepared for those questions. And I mean, I think that type of stuff makes a really good impression, right? If someone's like, well, what about this? And then if you can come back, right there in the room with an answer, or like reply to the email in 15 minutes with a report or a breakdown or something like that. I mean, that can really, I've seen how that can be really impressive to stakeholders, owners, and folks of that nature. Okay. The one more thing I want to note, those are all about that, whatever your specific project is. Those are all values that or benefits that you could get from that one specific project. There's also, though, the ongoing iterative across multiple projects process improvement that you can get to by doing this. Because if you don't right now have any projects where you have stakeholders asking you these types of detailed questions, you very well may find that you're eventually do have a customer like that. In fact, you may be working towards having a customer like that, right? Someone that is going to really kind of, turn the screw a little bit in terms of wanting detailed information, wanting to know that all that information, that you're keeping track of things really well. And if you start doing it now, even if there's not an explicit ask for that from your clients, right, you can learn the pitfalls, learn the techniques that work well, learn the process in such a way that when you do get to those clients that are that demanding, you're well prepared for it and the ins and outs of it, right? So I think getting better at it through practice is another reason to do it, even if right now you're not finding that other stakeholders are actually asking for this information at all or very often. Okay, now we're going to get into some specific kind of concepts here, right? And we're going to talk about some different areas about tracking progress, and we're going to talk about specificity, we're going to talk about presentation, and then we're going to talk about how you actually update this data on an ongoing basis, right? So those are sort of the three big categories we'll be talking through, and then a number of sort of detailed items underneath. So specificity. I've got kind of three principles here that I want to talk through, right? The first is somewhat obvious, but definitely worth thinking about, is aggregating is easy, disaggregating is hard, right? The second one is maybe a little less directly intuitive, but I think is definitely valuable, is the idea about having these non-binary states, like percentage complete, I'll show you in a minute, at the lowest level at least, and how that can introduce some additional ambiguity that you would be best to avoid. And then the last is about whether or not you should be tracking to the detailed level of specific dates when things are completed or not, and some pros and cons to that. Okay, so aggregation. As I'll show you a simple example, you can probably come up with some in your own head as well. Aggregating data up, very easy. Disaggregating down, difficult to sometimes impossible. And so you want to start at the right level of specificity or granularity for your reporting so that you won't later need to try and break it down further than what level you tracked at. As an example, right? If you're like, I'm just going to report on and track and keep track of how complete we are on a system by system basis. Then if later you need to find out on an equipment by equipment basis or just on some other kind of pure level, like zone by zone or building by building instead of system by system level, and you've only tracked it at system by system level, it's going to be challenging to do that, right? So you want to move down to a low enough level that you're going to be able to meet whatever reporting needs that you're going to have in the future. But you got to weigh that against the administrative burden of actually keeping track of that information, right? Because of course, the more granular you get, the more items there are to track, right? And so you need to balance those two out. Here's a very simple example. This is one of our customers in this particular case that is using our feature within CxAlloy called tasks and they use it on all their projects to track how the project is progressing. And they've got a couple of different kind of approaches that they take here. The one on the left is for their really simple projects. And you can see there's ultimately only 8 tasks that they have there, right? Because they just have this one high level category, test and balance report, FPTs complete, for example. Let's use that one, FPTs complete, right? And it's just done or not done. There it goes, right? They're just tracking 8 individual items, done or not done, FPTs complete. Okay, fine. If the project's small enough, this is perfectly appropriate. However, if it's a larger project, this is probably not going to give you the level of detail, and they have the same situation, right? So they have other templates, for example, this one you see on the right, where it's the same 8 tasks ultimately, but now subdivided into the different specific areas of the facility so that they can track on a kind of region by region or zone by zone level where they are with that, right? So you can see, okay, FPTs complete for cath prep, right? They've got an FPTs complete for PACU2, right? And so forth. And in fact, they have over 100 tasks in this project when they break it down this way. Now, the point is that you could very easily go from the one on the right to the one on the left. That's really simple, right? You just find all the ones that are FPTs complete. And if they're all done, then the whole thing's done. And if only some of them are done, you're not done. It's very difficult to go from the left to the right. I mean, you can't inherently with the data that's there. You have to go out and do more work now and go and pull up old emails or whatever, go visit the site again to determine, if you needed a breakdown zone by zone. So you really need to think about, what kind of reporting am I going to need to do? Of course, it's way easier to keep the one on the left updated than the one on the right, right? So that's, again, why you want to say, if I can make do with the one on the left and that's sufficient, great. Why give myself all that extra work, right? But if I'm going to need to report on a more detailed basis, I need to do that from the beginning. Okay, so some other thoughts here on specificity. I would really advise about avoiding excessive statuses. And in fact, the best example of excessive statuses is really trying to track at a percentage level directly. I also want to talk about in progress as something that is, I think, can be a good solution, but you want to have some thought about. And along with the excessive statuses or percentage-based reporting, you want to think about how that's going to potentially impact your reporting accuracy, because it can become more difficult to get a true picture of the progress depending on how you're doing your tracking at the lowest level. So let me use an example here to demonstrate this. So this is another real world example. And you can see they've got this duct install percentage complete I mean, there's a bunch of, columns here that they're tracking, but I want to point out the duct install percentage complete. So you have 75% complete. okay, you're using percentages here to track this. Seems fine, seems clear, right? My CV1 constant air volume box is 75% duct install complete. Okay, like there's nothing confusing there. Where's the ambiguity? Well, the ambiguity becomes when you roll this up. So if you say, okay, I'm going to aggregate into, the whole building or system level or something like that, and I have, all this equipment, and you can see at least all the ones we can see in the screenshot are 75% complete. If overall for the entire building, I get a total headline stat that duct install percentage complete is 50%. Given how I'm tracking it underneath, I don't know whether that means that 50% of them are done, which is possible. You could have, half of them have 100%, half have 0. I don't know if that means 2/3 of them are 75% done and 1/3 of them are 0% done, which would also get you to an overall 50% complete. I don't know if all of them are 50% complete, right? I don't have clarity from that top line aggregated number about what my underlying percentage or what my actual underlying completion rate is or what it means, right? Versus if everything is either done or not done, and then you roll that up and you say, I'm 50% done, you know that 50% of the equipment that you're tracking, duct install is complete, right? And 50% are not complete. That's just what it is based on the data. Right now, maybe some of those not complete ones are in progress. Okay, fine, but they're not complete is the important thing. So if you're doing this percentage-based tracking at the lowest level, right, there's no sort of subdividing that you can see here. I think I would caution you against that because you're going to lose this clarity as you roll up higher. Now, what you could do here is to use instead an in-progress status, which we will get to in a minute, for any percentage between 0 and 100. But at that point, I think you probably don't even want to put a percentage in at all. Because again, the other thing to consider is what's the administrative overhead of tracking a percentage, right? Okay, it's 60%, now it's 64%, now it's 78%. Is the time and effort I'm taking to determine that percentage meaningful enough in terms of the reporting side of things to really be recording that? Or would I be better with the done, not done, or a done in progress or not done in progress done sort of approach, right? Let me give you another example about percentage. I just kind of enjoyed this one. These are all real reports, like I said, and we're all doing our best. So, but I sort of enjoyed this one because this one demonstrates some of the like, what do these percentages mean, right? So if you look at the equipment delivery column, right, kind of in the middle there, you'll see we've got 100% equipment delivery, but then we have 2 that are 80% and 1 that's 90%. Now, what does that mean? Like if it's 80% delivered, I guess some of the parts haven't arrived yet. 8 out of 10 parts are there. 9 out of 10 parts are there. It's just the meaning. It's hard to deduce the meaning, and this is even not from the aggregate level, even at the individual level, right? Like I don't know where that is. You also see that for whatever reason, 80 and 90% are seen as, black, nothing special about them. But over in the design column, the first column of percentages, 50% gets a red. Okay. I guess that's just an arbitrary sort of decision. You also see that there's a status on the far right, and that one gets a red dot, whereas the other ones get a green dot, even though, there's a mixed sort of percentage delivery. There's just, right, there's some real ambiguity here, and I think a lot of that is coming from the percentages. And it kind of bleeds through. And so if you're the person reviewing this, maybe you get caught up in the details about why is this at 80%, and you kind of miss the forest for the trees, and you're actually doing a disservice to whoever you hand this off to, because it's going to be harder for them to understand what they should glean from this report, right? All right, let's talk about in progress. I think in progress is a reasonable way to split the difference here, and this is a good example of a report. They use 3 statuses. I mean, technically 4 are not applicable, but they've got a complete or a not complete, an in progress, and a complete. If you zoom out to this report, this is still pretty easy to understand, and it's not confusing about what these things mean, right? So I've got a number that are not complete, Those are the pink ones. I've got some that are in progress. Those are yellow. I don't really care what percentage they are. I just know they've been started but aren't done yet. And then I've got my percentage that is complete. And the thing is, as you roll this up, it's still going to be clear. You're still going to get your very clear, this many are complete, or this percentage is complete, this percentage is in progress, and this percentage is not started. And you're not going to have the trouble that I talked about earlier with the percentages, where it's hard to know kind of what the underlying data really is. And I think visually, this is pretty clear to look at, right? Good use of color, we'll talk about that. Roll up, right? This is what I was just talking about. You can roll this data up and it communicates quite well, right? Okay, I've got, this many complete versus this many in progress versus this many not started. There's no confusion here about what the actual underlying situation is. All right, let's go ahead and talk about dates. So when you are marking these things, so let's go back for a second, right? This one, for example, no dates. It's just, for each of these items, they're just either green or not, right? Or some other color. We're not trying to record a date when it became green. It's just that it is done now. It is complete now. That's all I care about. But you'll see some of these trackers, and I have some examples we'll show, have dates in there. Okay, why and when should we do that or not? What's the benefit, right? And we're going to talk about establishing a baseline schedule and reporting against a baseline schedule when you are using those dates. So here's an example where the dates are included, right? So it looks similar to that other one we looked at a minute ago. Looks like here they're pretty much just done, not done sort of thing. But they're putting in an explicit date there. The challenge with this, of course, is just that it is, again, administrative burden, right? So that's the only real downside, in my opinion, to dates, right? And it's a very meaningful one that you definitely should pay attention to, because if you're going to track dates, a couple of things about it. One is you're going to really want to keep up with this tracker on a really regular basis, because it becomes harder and harder to work backwards to what the dates are. If you're updating your tracker once every month, once every 2 months or something like that, going back and figuring out when things were complete on a specific date level is going to be challenging, right? And probably not worth it. So if you're going to be tracking dates, you really probably want to update this. I'd say weekly sort of time frame would be a reasonable approach, so that it doesn't become overly challenging to record these dates. And so you're going to need to make sure you're prepared to do that in the process of that. And then you also need to just make sure that the flow of data that you're getting, however you're doing that, is sufficient to determine these dates, right? If you're getting sort of secondhand reports from contractors that they email you, stuff they did 2 months ago, that can be challenging too. I mean, you could record it just the day you receive it, but that then leads to maybe some inaccuracies. So you're going to want to have a pretty tight sort of reporting loop if you're going to track dates, right? What does that allow you to do? Well, if you are tracking dates, the benefit here is you get this baseline schedule capability, right? So you can put in your due dates, your target dates for when things are anticipated to happen, and then you can record the actual date when they did happen. That's the thing that takes the tight reporting loop, right? Is the actual dates these things were completed. And that then allows you to compare, what you expected versus what happened. And coming all the way back to the first thing we talked about, there's a lot of value there, right? In terms of testing your assumptions, being able to see when you have your early deviations, right? Having these date-based things, because then you can not only see, are we on track with where I expect to be, but also I guess it's a little more explicit, right? Because you have those dates in there about where you expected to be on this date and are you there or not, right? And the deviations become much easier to track, which is what you can see here in this example, right? So this is a report where someone is looking on a week-by-week basis how many they've completed compared to what their planned completion rate was. Now, this is getting into some construction schedule sort of stuff a little bit, which in my experience, looking at a lot of these reports, commissioning firms, at least United States-based commissioning firms, I found it's a little bit different out in Europe. There's more sort of date control schedule control that they tend to have out there. But certainly in the States, what I've seen is that this sort of level of tracking for the commissioning provider isn't super common, but sometimes is needed. And I find it in particular happens in the data center market, very demanding clients in that market, and a lot of oversight that they've got, right? And they sometimes want this level of data. You can't get this level of data unless you're tracking date completions, right? You've got to be tracking when things are complete in order to compare it on a week by week basis, for example, against the baseline. When you do so, though, you can get some very nice reports that, again, report quite quickly about where your deviations are occurring. Okay. We're going to shift now, and I'm going to move a little quicker through some of these pieces because I think they're a little more elementary, but they're definitely worth talking about. And that's on some aspects of presentation. So first thing I want to talk about is using color, right? Again, obvious, elementary, and yet it's interesting. I'm pulling these example reports, and some were very colorful in a useful way. Some were colorful in a less useful way, actually. And some had no color at all. And I think no color at all is a mistake, right? So here's an example. This is, again, real world example. I didn't go in there and remove the color. This is exactly as delivered. And it's all the data is there, but it does not read quickly, right? Okay, how far along are we? I don't know. I need to look at this for a minute to kind of actually look at the individual yeses and nos that you see here in order to determine that, right? Compare that to this. Again, real world example. Very similar, frankly. Only real difference is the use of color, but the use of color makes such a big difference here. I look at this, I go, okay, I can tell, at least from what I see in the screenshot, is that we are not very far along right now, right? We are maybe 10% into this project, maybe a little bit further, right? But that's about where we are. And I can tell that instantly, right? And I'm sure you could too, seeing this. You compare that to this, how far along are we? Give me a minute to look at it, right? So first thing is, if you're not using color, even this is very basic, green is done, red is not done, or something similar to that. Do it, right? Add it in there. It just really adds a lot, gives it such quick readability to do that. And so take that extra little time to do so. Now, here is another example. This is a little more involved, but I think is still effective. So this is one where they've actually categorized sort of their different milestones into these different color codes, right? It's probably tag, right? Red tag, yellow tag, green tag, blue tag sort of thing. But regardless, they sort of phased it out, and they've given the columns colors to sort of delineate where, one kind of phase ends and the next begins. And then they still use color inside the cells to denote when things are complete or not, with a blue background versus not, right? And so there is, I think, despite this being a more complex scenario, still quite readable and can work well. And so I think, you don't have to go, you can go beyond just the green, yes, or complete, or red, not complete, right? And still have it make sense and be usable. And in fact, add value to the tracker. Another thing I'll call out is once you're aggregating up, right, so that you're getting to the system level or location level or zone level or whatever you're doing in terms of your higher level aggregation, and therefore you're getting percentages. Because again, you won't want to use percentages as your baseline, right? But the aggregate levels become percentages. You can use the color scale, Excel calls it, and it's particularly easy. Excel has a conditional formatting option, that lots of great conditional formatting tools, and one click for percentages. You can just highlight a column of percentages, go to conditional formatting, and pick color scales. And there's some predefined scales, where 100% is green, 0% is red. There's some different options that they have there, and it's incredibly quick to apply. And again, increases the readability of your chart at a glance, or at your tracker at a glance, without needing to do much effort at all. And definitely is an improvement over just raw percentages, just all in black text, right? Because it makes it very easy for someone reviewing this to go, well, where are we having trouble? Well, let me look, where are we at 0%? Where are we at 50, right? just becomes incredibly evident what these numbers are without having to actually even read them, right? So I recommend the color scales for your aggregate level percentage-based reporting. Now, you can go wrong with color, right? This is another example that I found, and I can't tell you what these colors mean because now I don't know. Someone at some point may be on this and say, well, I put that together or one like that, and there's a legend on another sheet or something, right? Okay. I took all these screenshots myself. I didn't find a legend. I didn't look super closely, but I don't recall there was one on this page itself. And I don't know what these colors mean. They're not self-evident, right? We got a blue. Okay, we've got a green. The blue, I would think maybe means complete, except then we have the green. But then we also have kind of a lighter green, right? I don't know what this means. And so color alone isn't sufficient, or you need to be either using very obvious colors, or you need to have a legend, right there co-presented with it. Again, you might have some internal processes where everyone internally knows about this. But I think even if you've got something where it's an internal only tool and you can kind of educate everyone about how it works, it's still better to try to make things self-evident, right? As much as you can. So, something like this, I'd advise at least a legend, if not maybe different colors, depending on what's even trying to be represented here, which I am not sure on. All right. Next thing to talk about is charts, right? Another great high visual way to communicate. Now we're getting into, sort of like we looked at with the aggregate level percentages and the color scales. This is the type of reporting that you're going to tend to do to, higher level stakeholders that want that high level view of just where are we at? How are things progressing? Are we on track? Sort of information. Charts are a great example for that, right? Simple, sort of a donut. This is a donut chart, right? Filling it in gives that little visual quality to an otherwise boring percentage, right? And again, very quick to just visually pick up on. You don't really have to read it. I also like progress bars. If you're familiar with CxAlloy, we actually use these in a bunch of places, and I think they work really well to, again, very quickly communicate. And I'd say, in some ways, can be superior to the color scales, although similar effect, right? Where you can look at it, you don't actually have to register the exact percentages. You can just see it directly from the visual about, okay, these are done. These are, in the middle. And then maybe I have some that are not done at all or faring very poorly, right? So giving a little bit of that visual color, I think, is definitely valuable, especially when you're dealing with folks that are like, I just want that high level view. I just want to look at it and in 2 seconds know, where we're at. This is another example where, now this one I think is a little bit of a misfire in that they've got this bar chart for kind of percentage complete, right? But by having both the complete and the not complete, the outstanding, have color, it kind of confuses what I'm looking at, right? And so I would advise, keep it simple when you can. I don't think having the outstanding ones having that blue color really adds anything, and I think it makes it a little bit more complicated to understand what you're looking at versus if it was just orange bars, percentage complete, and that's it. It becomes very easy to understand that, okay, most of this, only half of these things I've even started basically. And the rest are yet to be done, all those ones where it shows blue. So sort of combining the chart concept with the color, right? Make sure that you're in your charts using a color in an effective way. And, this still communicates it, but I think could be improved by just reducing the color here and only having the complete habit. Now, this is a great one. I'm not going to go into too much detail because pivot tables are a pretty deep subject, actually, but I do want to call this out. So if you're using Excel to do this sort of tracking, any sort of progress tracking, you should really look at pivot tables as the way to create your aggregate reporting. So with a pivot table, what you do is you start with just sort of a standard, like a data table, maybe you'd call it, like this one here, right? Where you can see that they've got everything listed, and then they've got their status of level 3 and level 4 different tests, right? And they've got these values running down about where they're at. And you'll notice this column, second column from the left, called services. And in the screenshot, you only see electrical, but it goes on. There's other categories of services that are put into the spreadsheet. So you just have this sort of raw data table. The thing to note here is the repetition that happens. We're repeating the yet to offer, status. We're repeating the electrical services, right? We're repeating it over and over across each row. If you have a data table like this, it allows you to then build a pivot table in Excel, and it reports automatically, right? So this is a pivot table that from Excel with some custom coloring and formatting added to it. But the actual data sum and analysis here, or percentages and counts, are being calculated automatically through Excel pivot tables. And this can be really valuable, as I'll show you in a moment, in terms of how this can allow you to adjust for different reporting needs more easily, right? So as a very simple little example I put together, you might have something like this where you're saying, okay, I'm tracking on an equipment by equipment basis, completion of milestone 1, milestone 2, milestone 3. And I want to be able to report on that on an equipment type level, right? So I'm adding my own custom air handling units row in there and summing it and getting a percentage count there. Great. The question then becomes, though, what if then later someone says, well, I actually want you to report on this not by equipment type, but I want to see by phase, or I want to see by building, or I want to see by zone. Oh crap. Well, now I got to go in and I got to rearrange all of my data, put in these new divider rows, do the sums again, right? I gotta kind of change everything in order to get this alternate aggregate reporting out of the same underlying raw data. What you can do, though, instead, is you can switch it around, and instead of doing your own custom column header or row, like equipment type like that, you make it a column, like you can see here, equipment type, and I'm repeating it. Then I have another column for building, and I've got different buildings, and I have phase, and I have different phases. I still have the same underlying data. I did make some other little tweaks to this in terms of, adding a not started and putting a color there and some stuff like that. But regardless, it's the same raw data at the base level, right? Which is for each equipment and each milestone, is it complete or not? That's ultimately what's driving this. But then I can build whatever pivot tables I want. I can say, well, show me this summarized by phase. I can say, show this summarized to me by building, show this summarized to me by equipment type. And I don't have to reconstruct the actual data table itself that's feeding into that higher level reporting. And on that pivot table, I can apply the color scale that I mentioned earlier, like I've done here. And this is a very simple example. You can go a lot farther than this. I'm not a pivot table master or expert, but I have found them really useful for certain scenarios. And some of this progress tracking is an excellent candidate for pivot tables because of the flexibility it gives you in terms of aggregate reporting. And all you really need to do is, like I've done in this example, is make those reporting categories columns in your spreadsheet, and then you can build pivot tables off of them. All right, last thing to talk about here is, how do you keep this data updated, right? One of the things I found really interesting as we put together our milestones feature is that I assumed that it was going to be difficult to identify whether something was done or not, right? Like that was going to be the challenge, right? Is it done or not? And there's going to be all this custom logic we have to build to sort of figure that out, or things of that nature. But that's not hard at all, right? Any individual item you look at least in our system, and I think in a lot of systems, right, there's like a status associated to it. We have statuses in our system. Most online systems have it. Or if you have your own tracker, you're going to just have a like, yeah, it's done or not, right, sort of answer. The hard part is the relationships, because to say that some milestone is met, it may not just be that it may be the set of different statuses I need to combine together to get that answer, right? So it's not just that the equipment is installed. It's also whether or not, all the issues that were identified during the installation phase are now closed, right? And so it's being able to not only find that equipment in its status, but to then go one step beyond and find the child issues related to it, and specifically the ones that are installation issues, and see whether those are closed or not, right? And the challenging part is that hop. The challenging part is actually finding those related items and evaluating them. The evaluation, again, is easy. Each issue would either be closed or not. The hard part is getting to them effectively and efficiently. So as an example, this is what we put together for our new milestones feature, right? Where, as you can sort of see here, the complexity that this represents is primarily in the relationships, right? That the checks that we're doing are very easy, right? Status of the equipment is installed or verified. The status of the checklist is complete. The status of the test is passed, right? That the low-level check is easy. The harder part is the sort of sub-nested relationship evaluation that we want to do in order to, find all the right items that we're concerned about that tell us whether or not this is where it needs to be or not, right? So that's one of the challenges. And so what you'll find is during updates is you'll probably spend a lot of time getting to the data, not trying to figure out what its status is. It's just finding it, right? That tends to be the challenge. So given that, I think there's a couple of things to think about, right? And one is to leverage your tools, maybe sometimes build some new tools or techniques or capabilities in order to facilitate finding the items quickly, right? Because it's really more about finding them, again, in my experience, than seeing where they're at, right? Once you found them, then you're good. So for example, here's an example, a customer system or tracker, and right, they're saying, okay, scripts in CxAlloy. Now, one thing that they could do further on from this, in my opinion, is put in a link directly to with like some filters applied that will direct them directly to those items just through a click link here, right? You could do the same thing, like bookmark links to find those items in the future, or if it's Excel to another Excel file, right? You can have interlinked Excel files with links that you drop in there, right? And so make it repeatable in terms of finding the data in the future as you do your updating. And last thing here, because I know we're right at time where we wanted to stop, is if you've got, whether it's CxAlloy, some other online commissioning platform, whether it's something more generic, smart forms, Smartsheet, or things like that, or just even Excel, like so many of our examples have been today, look at the capability that they give you, right? CxAlloy tasks, I showed you this at the very beginning. Okay, that was a great tool for one of our customers, especially for their smaller projects, just to track where they are with things. And so they use the task, right? If you, if you've got Excel and you're experienced at it, not only use Excel, but learn about all the ins and outs of it. Learn about the pivot tables if you haven't done so yet, some of the more advanced functionality, and make sure you're making the most effective use of those tools that you can. And of course, we're looking to make ours more effective on this front. This is where all this information that I'm sharing with you today comes from, right? This is some work in progress screenshots of our milestone capability that we're building out and currently have as like an early access feature, right? And we're hoping to make this something that's going to be really beneficial to a lot of customers and remove a lot of that effort they're currently spending on updating things by doing it automatically for them, right? So we're looking to improve what we can offer in terms of leveraging tools to automate and administer this sort of tracking. So that's my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and open it back up or hand it over to the EMA for Q&A.
Thanks very much, Jacob. That was a great presentation. Appreciate it. So we're ready now for Q&A. If anybody wants to put in their questions, and we can queue those up. But in the short term, just before we get started, I had a couple of questions of my own. I, in a past life, was a project manager, although not for commissioning projects. And, you recommended avoiding percentages when they seem like an obvious choice for checklists, and, being able to show how close or how far you are from meeting an objective. People, live and die by those percentages. So, what would you recommend, or do you have a personal preference for how you get away from the percentages and how you like to use those?
Yeah, the thing is the percentages, for example, checklists and tests, right? That's something that's in CxAlloy, and we report on percentages like in the interface, right? Like you're 50% complete, like we
Sure.
do that right there. And to me, it's more just about where you draw the divide. So it's not that that's not valuable. I just don't think it's a good choice to put into sort of a higher level tracker as these ones that I've been presenting today. Again, because of you want to have your base level of data in a tracker like this still not be as granular as maybe the data ultimately is elsewhere or you can get to, right?
Okay.
And because again, a big sort of goal in my experience and working with all sorts of commissioning providers and what they're trying to put together is the aggregation capability of this tracker. Say, yeah, so I want to track these item by item information, but a big deliverable out of this tracker is to be able to then say system by system how we're doing, or discipline
Yeah.
by discipline how we're doing, and so forth. And so it's less about that percentage not being valuable in and of itself. It's that it's not particularly, I don't think it's the right choice personally in my experience in looking at this stuff for a tracker that is trying to do sort of the things that we talked about here today. I think it's great to have that sort of percentage tracking directly in your tool or at a lower level when you really need to dig in. I just think that you're going to not get the benefit and definitely have some cost to it if you bring it into a tracker that's meant to be more of a sort of a high level view.
Yeah, like a dashboard kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So you briefly touched on target dates and whether they are synchronized with the construction schedule. You kind of drew a kind of a differentiation between how it happens in the US and how it happens in Europe. Um, you know, do you find that they are synced, these target dates are synced with the construction schedule? And then how does that differ between the US and Europe kind of at a high level?
Yeah, well, what I've seen historically, and I'm out of Atlanta, and most of our customers are in the U.S., but we've particularly in data centers, we've got more activity happening in Europe now, and so it's been interesting to see some of those differences. But focusing on what I've seen in the U.S. is I found generally commissioning is not date driven. The GC owns the construction schedule, owns those dates, owns the actual tools and stuff that uh, where all those dates are maintained and updated and so forth. But I generally have not seen that commissioning folks concern themselves too much with syncing with those dates at all. Even when they're using dates, a lot of times there might be their own kind of internal dates that they're saying that are not truly synced, but are just more like they're using that construction schedule as a reference for their own date setting about what they want to do. So I think that's what I generally have seen, and I've seen it gets complicated if you do try to sync to dates because there's just inherently different things that the commissioning provider versus the GC are trying to do, and different incentives they have. However, two things. One is in data centers, particularly, again, I touched on this. Those tend to be more demanding clients that are kind of dictating how the program should run and process will run to the commissioning authority. I find that a lot of the case. And then also in Europe, what I've seen, and I'm still kind of a neophyte in terms of Europe processes, but they distinguish between kind of a commissioning, I forget the terms they use, but kind of a commissioning manager versus the commissioning provider, and they both are commissioning, but one's more schedule focused and one's more about execution. And there has been more about, hey, can we get synced up with like the P6 schedule or things like that, right? But I don't know. I found that anytime I've waded into conversations or been present during conversations, it sounded very complicated to me without a lot of upside. So maybe it has to happen in some cases, but I think that generally what I see folks do is avoid it. And I think that if you go that route, it's going to definitely introduce a lot of complexity that, maybe value for that particular client, but I don't think is a good go-to approach.
So towards the end, you were showing an example with the script in CxAlloy, and you did talk briefly about how you're introducing more tools for, to automate. I think it was getting data out of CxAlloy, exporting. And so I'm just wondering, do you have any clients who are using that to pull those values that are kind of bookmarked with that script in CxAlloy note? Are they bringing it in an automated fashion into the Excel tracker?
So I haven't seen too much of that coming into Excel, but there's been some of that. What we've seen more of our customers doing, especially some of our larger enterprise customers that are more, I think, well versed in like Power BI and Tableau and tools like that, is they've been automating some of this progress tracking stuff into their own dashboards that are built and managed through a Power BI being the one that I've been the most directly involved in and aware of. And we have an API, and so ultimately the Power BI data is pulled from the API, but then it's sort of stored in this intermediary, Power BI managed database. I've seen different approaches. Sometimes they even add another intermediary and stuff, but ultimately I have seen a number of customers leverage our API to pull that data in,
Mm-hmm.
and then to automatically, report on progress. And that gives you the slicing and dicing really easily too, like I talked about with pivot tables, but like it's just all built in. I mean, Power BI is not my favorite system. I've played with it a little bit. Like many Microsoft things, I find it confusing at times, but when you build it right, you can do really cool things with it. So we do have some customers that have done that, and they've leveraged the API to pull that over. And we do actually have a Power BI connector that we're working on that we should have available as part of like as an add-on option in the future. So we're pushing that direction a little bit more. But I have seen some automation, not too much with Excel though. Again, it's been more with those larger programs.
I would love to see a Power BI connector that was like really Betty Crocker, where you could just really say, this goes here and this goes here, and
Yeah.
that just maps them up really well.
Yeah,
It's
not
tricky.
not that simple yet in my
Nope.
experience.
No.
But we're working on it.
So one thing that we didn't talk about too much in this session, but we are the Energy Management Association, and a lot of our audience, they are EMPs, energy managers, and I kind of have this idea that that the commissioning agents, they make sure that everything's functioning within the tolerances that are defined by the building owner. But then it seems like the energy management that would be more on the handoff side. So, do you have any tools on that handoff side to support the people who are going to be, maintaining these things? And, do you have any suggestions there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we've got a couple of things that what we have right now is basically just good data handoff.
Mm.
Depending on what the needs are for the energy management is maybe more or less meaningful. But that's been one of the things that's always sort of bugged me about the way the construction industry works, is particularly when you shift from construction to operations or occupancy. A lot of times, a lot of data that was gathered and tracked and recorded during the construction, and often by the commissioning provider in particular, is just not carried through, and that same work is done again. Maybe energy meters are being logged and where they exist and what they are and stuff like that, for example. And then once you hand it over, a different team, a maintenance team or facility management team of some sort, comes in and goes and records all that data again. Which always just bugs me that goes on. There's some, I think, economic incentives that kind of lead to it continuing to exist that way. But we've tried to do our part within CxAlloy, at least, to like have really good exports, different formats, Excel, Kobe, SQLite exports. I mentioned the API and stuff to like make it so you can pull that data out really easily in very visible formats. That's one thing. The other thing is we have some internal efforts that we're going to share more about in the future around integrating more directly with like building analytics systems that I think in the future will be really key or impactful for that sort of concern and that sort of question. But that's kind of that's in the works, but more to come on that in the future for us.
Okay, well, I think that brings us almost to the top of the hour. Thank you again, Jacob, for the presentation, and thank you also to CxAlloy. Stay tuned, everybody, for your certificates if you've been here for almost all of the webinar. And if you were on your phone, if you joined on your phone and you don't see it within an hour, if you don't see those certificates, then let us know, because sometimes there's a funny thing that happens with Zoom for people who join on their phones. So the next event that I think all of you would be interested in is we have the Virtual Energy Management Professional Seminar. This is an event that's 2 days, 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern each day. It's run by Robert Knadler, one of our top instructors, and this is a great way to prepare for the EMP exam. It is not required and they don't teach to the test, but it can be a really good way to prepare for the EMP exam if you're thinking of doing that. So let us know if you have any interest, and that'll be July 24th and 25th, 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern. Again, thank you, Jacob. Thank you, CxAlloy.
Thanks.